Welcome to History Uncensored with me, Bianca Nobilo. On this episode, I'll be finding out from barrister and author Philippe Sands how Cold War enemies in waiting came together to prosecute crimes against humanity for the first time.
That was what the prosecutors confronted, how to destroy in legal terms these people who actually, by the time they were in the dock, came across as rather human.
Author Jack L. Hyde joins me to talk about the most frightening question of all. Were the Nazis normal?
He was a charmer. He was everybody's favorite prisoner.
And the Nazis on film, with the man who has played second in command Hermann Göring on screen, legendary actor Brian Cox.
He was not intrinsically nasty. He really wasn't. But he was clear about how Germany should be shaped.
Plus, we uncovered the real threat to Nuremberg's legacy, fading public memory, with Professor David Cohen, head of Stanford University's virtual tribunal. It's 1945. As the Allies liberate occupied Europe, what they find shocks the world: the horror of the Nazi death camps. Bringing to justice those who've just implemented the so-called final solution, systematic murder of European Jews, becomes their number one priority. But the leaders of Britain, America, and the USSR have very different ideas of what that means. Churchill at first thinks summary execution is the answer. No trial, no defense, no pulpit for the war criminals. Stalin wants a classic Soviet show trial for propaganda purposes. But the US under Roosevelt wants real justice. And that means an actual court trial with real defense rights and a verdict that could go either way. The highest stakes possible. And that's what's agreed. 22 high-ranking Nazis are facing trial, including Albert Speer, Rudolf Hess, and Martin Bormann in absentia. But the biggest fish of all is the most senior Third Reich leader still alive, Reich Marshal Hermann Göring. And we'll hear lots about him in this episode. The only problem is that there was no internationally recognized law to prosecute the Nazis with. Enter Raphael Lemkin and Hersch Lauterpacht, two lawyers who formulate the ideas of genocide and crimes against humanity to protect groups and individuals against the state, respectively. So to understand how these ideas came together at the trial and what happened next, I'm turning to Philippe Sands. His book, East-West Street, traces the intertwined lives of Lemkin and Lauterpacht and how these new legal concepts converged in the Nuremberg courtroom. Hello, Philippe. Thank you so much for joining History Uncensored. Really appreciate your time.
Wonderful to be with you.
So your fantastic book, East-West Street, tells this very gripping story of how the categories of crimes against humanity and genocide emerged. But before we get into those stories, can you paint a picture for our viewers and listeners about the moral and legal landscape as it was at the end of World War II?
Sure. So if you go back 80 years to that moment in the summer of 1945 and imagine you're in London and four countries come together, the US, the Soviets, the British, the French, and they've decided they're going to put on a trial to indict the leading Nazis that they have caught for international crimes. This has never happened before in human history. It is the first time, and they have a problem. There's no court. They've got to invent a court. There's very few crimes. They've got war crimes, but that's about it. So they've got to create some new crimes, and they come up with crimes against humanity, genocide, the crimes against peace, as they call it then today, the crime of aggression. They've got to find some judges. They've got to find prosecutors. They've got to find defense counsel. They're starting from scratch, and they did it literally in a matter of months. It's almost remarkable in Westminster Hall. And today, 80 years on, all roads lead to that moment. Everything that has followed is built on the foundations of what they did at Nuremberg, the Yugoslav tribunal, the Rwanda tribunal, the indictments today by the International Criminal Court, and so on and so forth. So it was as huge a moment as one can imagine.
Philippe, how close was it to not happening? Because we know that other avenues are being explored, like summary execution, which Churchill was a proponent of, or a show trial, Soviet style. But they landed here. I think that historical contingency is fascinating.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I'd really love to have been a fly on the wall at Yalta when Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin are discussing what to do, and they agree they're going to come up with a trial. It is indeed the case. It's documented. I've seen the correspondence that Winston Churchill thought the trial was not a good idea. Just line him up, shoot him. He was talked out of it by the two others. And of course, Roosevelt wanted one type of trial and Stalin wanted another type of trial. And they ended up settling on this sort of amalgam of different legal traditions. But they reached an agreement by February, March 1945. It then took them 3 months to get to London and negotiate a text. And that was agreed in August 1945. So unbelievably quickly. And then in October 1945, they've identified the 24 defendants, top Nazis, and they've produced an indictment against them. And the trial starts on the 20th of November, 1945. You couldn't invent today. To do such a thing would take years.
We could be very cynical about the motives of politicians or even people in the legal profession at times. But it sounds like it really was an approach born out of principle and wanting to have that moral authority. Is that the prevailing reason for it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, it's not a perfect trial. There's elements of lopsided justice about it. It does have a sort of victor's justice. So, crimes were perpetrated by others, by the Soviets, by the British, by the Americans. War is war. And they basically decided they would exclude that. They would make it about the Germans. But I think their audiences were various. One of the big audiences was the people of Germany. They wanted to tell an authoritative story to the people of Germany about what had happened. And then on the British, American and Soviet side, they wanted to tell their home populations. And of course, they had different agendas in each country. But one of the things that jumps away from me, I mean, I've spent years as a professor and as a barrister doing cases on this stuff with the material, is that the defendants all thought they got a decent and fair trial. And we get that from an amazing document, which is the diaries of the psychologist, Gustav Gilbert, who records his conversations with the defendants. And they all basically say, the president of the tribunal, Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, treated us very fairly, correctly. We had lawyers, we made our arguments, no criticism of the process. And I think that's significant.
There's been one or two new documents, I believe, revealed, or they were found in London, where they sketch out possible defences for the Nazis, like, I didn't know, I was just following orders. Is there any point that would have been a robust and worrying defence for the Allies?
Those were the defences that they wanted to make. I mean, it's pretty entertaining if you go back over the material now. Geoffrey Lawrence's wife, Marjorie, who was obviously a fantastic character, kept a daily diary. And Lawrence was the presiding judge, and his grandson, Patrick Lawrence, KC, I've come to know him well, he's become a good friend. He has those diaries, those scrapbooks. So I've gone back over the scrapbooks, which are utterly fascinating because they reveal the private conversations amongst the judges, amongst the prosecutors. And one of the things the Americans were obsessed about was they wanted everyone to be convicted and to be sentenced to death. And they were worried that it would be a total disaster if anyone was acquitted or, got a lesser sentence. And of course, that's exactly what happened. Out of the 24, one, Martin Bormann, was never caught, so he was absent. Another, Robert Ley, committed suicide early on. And of the other 22, 3 were acquitted. Essentially the economic and financial people, the people who ran the Bank of Germany type of stuff. And that, I think, with the benefit of hindsight, historically, was a good thing because it reinforced the legitimacy of the process. But the Americans considered those acquittals to be a total disaster. Of the other 19, I think 10 were sentenced to death and 9 got periods of imprisonment from life to 10 years. But I think if you look in the round, The defences that you've mentioned are exactly the kinds of things that they argued. We were just following superior orders. That's rejected by the 4 judges of the tribunal. And the other thing that is rejected, very significant for today, is the idea that they have immunity because it was official conduct. That is rejected right from the outset. The Chief Justice, Robert Jackson, the Chief Prosecutor, was actually a Justice of the US Supreme Court who was on leave, released, and he runs the whole case. And he writes a letter in June 45 to the President of the United States. By now it's Harry Truman. And he says, look, we're not going to have any immunity. No one can claim immunity. These are terrible crimes. Immunity is an obsolete relic. It's the time of the kings, and we're well past that. And it's not what we do in the United States. And the irony of that, of course, is that very recently the US Supreme Court, just last year, has given a judgment in a case brought by Mr. Trump in relation to proceedings in the US. And they've ruled that a former US president has absolute immunity in relation to core constitutional functions. So they've departed from the position adopted by Robert Jackson 80 years ago. So these are very timely and real issues even today.
And what's your legal view or your reflection on that? Are we starting to forget the principles of Nuremberg and the never again approach?
Well, it's an interesting moment. I've done a couple of interviews in the last days, and people asked me what's significant about the 80th anniversary. So the last big anniversary was the 75th. And on the 75th anniversary, I could still get on the phone and call 1 or 2 people who were in courtroom 600 during the trial. And I could, one of them, Yves Begbeder, who was a young French lawyer, he was 21 in 1945. He was the assistant to the French judge. I could ring him up 5 years ago and say, what was it like on the opening day of the trial? And he would describe to me, it was amazing talking to him, absolutely amazing, because he was present in history. Of course, he's passed away in the last couple of years, so there's no one left to talk to. And that direct experience has now gone. And I think the disappearance of direct experience creates a space. Look, the world's in a really difficult place right now. We've got conflicts in Ukraine, in the Middle East, in Sudan. We've got terrible things happen. Robert Jackson opened the trial 80 years ago saying never again. Well, it hasn't been quite the same thing, but there are terrible things happening. So that hasn't quite worked out as people wanted. But the direct experience of the trial is gone. And I think that creates a space.
Now, Robert Jackson's obviously remembered as this larger-than-life figure. But in the early stages of the trial, he floundered. Can you tell us about why the cross-examination went a bit wrong?
Yes. So there is a very famous moment, which I think is depicted in this new film, which I haven't seen, on Nuremberg with Russell Crowe. The famous cross-examination by Robert Jackson of Hermann Göring. Now, the thing you need to know about Robert Jackson, he was a very fine lawyer, but he's what we call an appeals lawyer. He did appeals on points of law. He was not a cross-examiner. He did not know how to cross-examine a witness. And so he starts, and very quickly, it's a disaster. Göring is quicker than him, more agile than him, starts running rings around him. There's a wonderful journalist in the room called Janet Flanner, who is the reporter for the New Yorker magazine, and she writes a withering article about the hopelessness of Robert Jackson's cross-examination. And very soon he has to stop, and he passes the baton to David Maxwell Fyfe, who is his British counterpart and is the sort of deputy chief prosecutor, former Attorney General of the UK. And he picks up the pieces, and Maxwell Fyfe was a cross-examiner. So very soon, order is restored. Göring is, beaten into a pulp by Maxwell Fyfe. Flannett reports that, the British took up the cudgels and quickly destroyed Göring. Rather humiliating for Robert Jackson. The funny thing was, I mentioned earlier that the scrapbooks kept by Marjorie Lawrence, the wife of the president, Geoffrey Lawrence, and there is a cutting. She's got the New Yorker article marked up with little squiggle marks and exclamation marks. And obviously it was a bit of an embarrassing thing. But I think if you look in the round, Robert Jackson did an extraordinary job in the openings, in the closings, memorable speeches. He just wasn't a cross-examiner.
And if we go back to the beginning of the trial, specifically with Göring, obviously you can't separate these two things, but was it that Jackson was just not a cross-examiner, or was it that he'd really underestimated Göring, or the charisma or persuasiveness of some of these figures? Because obviously they wanted to treat them as monsters. They'd seen the evidence of the atrocities.
Yeah. No, it's a really good question. No, I think there's truth to this. It wasn't just that Jackson was not a cross-examiner. Göring was super smart. Göring had a strategy. He had an argument. He, had a mastery of tiny points of detail. So he would pick apart the assumptions in Jackson's questions and basically attack in front of the judges the entire basis of Jackson's questioning. And he had a huge personality. This would be very significant. I mean, again, we've got this from the diaries of Gustav Gilbert, the psychologist, that Göring controlled all the other defendants. There was a famous incident. What would happen was they would meet for lunch and for dinner, all the defendants, and it became very clear soon to the prosecutors that they had to stop the meeting for lunch and for dinner, because Göring would use the lunches and the dinners to basically prepare everyone for the next stage of the hearings. And there was a famous moment when one of the lawyers in the case, Hans Frank, who was a defendant number 7, he was Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer from 1928 to 1933. He's one of my 4 characters in East-West Street, my book. He, at some moment, in very general terms, says to the judges, look, I accept some sort of responsibility for what has happened. And Göring comes down on him like a ton of bricks and just says to him, no German can ever accept responsibility on behalf of the state in this way. And Frank recants a few weeks later, and that is a reflection of the sheer power of personality, the force of personality of Hermann Göring, which Robert Jackson had underestimated.
And when Albert Speer broke, because like you said, Göring managed to cohere and keep everybody together and saw his role in this new circumstance as still being the leader and keeping them together as a group. How important was that to the trial and to the other defendants? Oh,
it was really important. But I think Göring met his match with Albert Speer. So Albert Speer was the Nazis' main architect and very close to Adolf Hitler, and an extraordinarily smart character who managed to weave a defense which was based in part on the absence of knowledge of what was going on, together with others were responsible for the major decisions. He just was involved in, building and construction and so on and so forth. And essentially, he gets himself off the hook. And he is sentenced. He is convicted, but I think he's sentenced to just 20 years in prison. And when he leaves prison, he writes a book. And he gives interviews to various journalists. There's an absolutely fantastic book called by a journalist called Gita Sereni, called Albert Speer, His Struggle with Truth, in which they go into all of these things, his strategy, what he did during the Hitler years, and so on and so forth. And you get a sense, and I think this is the humanizing side of it, that these people, and I'm very careful, I never describe them as monsters, because the reality is they were smart, they were cultured, they were capable of love and grace and decency, but they also did absolutely monstrous things. And this comes out when you follow the proceedings in Nuremberg and when you read the accounts subsequently of those who survived. And that is the complexity of a process like this. It's easy to pigeonhole them and say things are black and white and these are terrible, evil people. But actually, if you and I were to sit down tonight and have dinner with Albert Speer or Hans Frank, the terrible truth is we'd actually have a pretty good evening with them. And that was what the prosecutors confronted, how to destroy in legal terms these people who actually, by the time they were in the dock, came across as rather human.
They're difficult things to admit and say, because obviously nobody wants to hear that harsher truth, that actually they were human and deemed to be sane apart from lay, and that they did show empathy at points. when my grandfather was in Auschwitz, he was a prisoner, he was beaten, he was on death marches, he had to clean the gas chambers, but yet a Nazi snuck him a glass of milk when he could. One once pulled him out from train tracks.
Yeah.
And I find them such disturbing truths to hold together, but they are truths nonetheless. And on that point of empathy and sort of ability to be shocked, when they showed the camp footage in the trial, black and white, for the first time, and sort of stunned the tribunal into silence, how important was that moment? Because when I watched Nuremberg and I saw that footage, I'd only seen stills, I think. And even though I knew exactly what had happened, I have family history that ties me to that, I was flabbergasted. So when they hadn't ever seen something like this before, what was the impact on the tribunal defendants?
It was one of the huge moments of the trial. It was strategic to bring it up very early. So it was done within the first month to basically set the scene for the judges, for the press, for the defendants. It was done very strategically. They placed bright lights in the ceiling of the courtroom so that the faces of the defendants could be observed while they were watching the film. We know from the diaries of Gustave Gilbert that the defendants were absolutely shocked by what they see. It had a profound effect on them. We know from the writings of the judges, their private diaries, that they were horrified by what they saw. In fact, right now, I've actually just spent the morning reading up about Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears, the British musicians. And what I'd known was that Benjamin Britten had been to Belsen, where some of the footage you've described and was shown in the courtroom was filmed. He went with Yehudi Menuhin, the famous violinist, and they performed for some of the, detainees who had survived. And Britain was unable to talk about it for the next 40 years. It was only right at the end of his life that he felt able to describe what he had seen in person. And the footage that you describe captures that. It had never been seen before. It was utterly shocking. And I think it changed the course of the trial.
It was the same for my grandfather, actually. It was only really in the decade before he died that he was able to begin to articulate what had happened. And sometimes we'd find reams of writing about liberation and camp experiences just on the back of random notepads or other work that he was doing. Like it was returning to him in flashes. So when we look at the legacy of Nuremberg, you've spoken quite a bit on a really interesting idea that when genocide was introduced by Raphael Lemkin as a way to protect the group, and obviously with a very noble motive to do so, and crimes against humanity by Hirsch Lauterpacht, as you describe in your book, has their creation as categories had on balance a positive effect to protect humanity, or has it created this hierarchy of crime where sometimes I think I've heard you say before that a genocide makes page 1 but a crime against humanity makes page 30 as an example?
It's very problematic. I'm very torn and conflicted. In life, we're often expected to say things are like this or like that. And expressing uncertainties is never, in this age, very popular. But I'm really torn about this. I really respect what Lauterpacht and Lemkin did. I think they're two remarkable human beings. But the reality is that these two concepts, crimes against humanity, which is about the protection of individuals, and genocide, which is about the protection of groups, were concocted in a matter of weeks. And there wasn't a detailed sort of legislative process thinking through how they relate, what are the unintended consequences. And so it was done to basically put something into the Nuremberg Statute. And over the passage of time, exactly as you say, a hierarchy has emerged between these crimes in the court of public opinion, not amongst the lawyers. And genocide has emerged as the crime of crimes. I think it's partly the power of the word. It evokes absolute horror. It's partly that somehow people have a feeling that killing groups is worse than killing large numbers of individuals. But this has given rise to a problem. So to take a practical example, Srebrenica in the former Yugoslavia, 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men murdered, described, characterized by the Yugoslav tribunal as a genocide, one of the few ever to be characterized as a genocide. By contrast, 3 million men, women, children in the Democratic Republic of Congo at about the same time murdered, and it's a war crime and a crime against humanity, not a genocide. And no one mentions that. But is the killing of 8,000 individuals somehow worse than the killing of 3 million? I don't think it is. And I think putting people on a pedestal because their crime is a genocide rather than only a crime against humanity or a war crime has ended up being very, very unhelpful. You know, I've done cases in relation to Yugoslavia where the courts have ruled that what has happened is a crime against humanity or a war crime. And the consequential headlines in the newspapers, for example, in Belgrade is, "We are innocent." In other words, no one cares about war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I think that's very, very unfortunate. That's actually now being adjusted. There is a new negotiation taking place, which has just started, well, it'll start in January, to negotiate a parallel convention to the Convention on Genocide, which is on crimes against humanity. And I think that will be helpful. It'll take a few years to be adopted. But there is an issue here. In my view, there's no sort of Premier League of horrors. All of these things are terrible. Whatever label you put on them, it shouldn't happen. There should be accountability. And I resist the sense that some acts of killing are somehow, because of the label, worse than others.
And just if I may, final thought just to put to you. It's fascinating. In East West Street, you talk about how Lemkin and Lauterpacht, as well as your maternal, I think, grandfather, all at points were in Lemberg, what is now Lviv in Ukraine. And when you think about that resonance, you think about what's happening in Ukraine, what's happened in the Middle East recently, and like you mentioned, former Yugoslavia, Rwanda. In your profession, what do you feel like those men and Nuremberg gave us?
They gave us hope. And that is not without consequence. It's more than nothing. These crimes, these words have not stopped the horrors, but they've provided a benchmark. And the difference between today and 80 years ago is that when atrocities happen, we now have pieces of paper called treaties, and we have international courts that we can go to that can at least signal to those who are on the receiving end of horror that they are not alone and that what is going on should not be happening. And I think that is incredibly significant.
Well, Philippe, you know, one of the things we talk about on the show is uncovering the modern echoes of the parts of the past that we're covering. And so clearly you are that for these men. So it's been such a privilege to speak to you and to understand your work as a continuation of what they do as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
As we've just heard, at Nuremberg, the world witnessed for the very first time images of what had been happening in Nazi death camps. Only then did the true horror of the final solution of the Jews become apparent. Because often in history, a picture really is worth 1,000 words. And let's take a look at some of the other images that help tell the story of the Nuremberg trials. The first picture here, the ruins of Nuremberg. Why decide to host the trials here? Well, there were practical reasons. Believe it or not, it was one of the only courthouses in the country that was still standing. It had a courthouse and a prison under one roof, which was very helpful. But also it was the symbolic value of this choice, which really resonated with the Allies. Having been the birthplace of the Nuremberg rallies, which helped the Nazis rise and consolidate power, it was also where the Nuremberg laws, which stripped rights from Jews, were announced. We've got the judges, one from each of the Allied nations. You've got Britain, France, America, and the USSR. We know that not all of the Allies, certainly at first, thought the trial was a good idea. Churchill was a proponent of summary execution, Stalin a show trial, but ultimately they were convinced that this was the way to retain the moral high ground and set a precedent, a foundation for the future. Next up, this is a mugshot of Hermann Göring when he was first taken into custody. And he, seeing himself as this decorated Reich Marshal, had assumed that he would be negotiating with the Allies on the post-war world. They obviously saw him very differently as a criminal. And also, when he was captured, he was extremely overweight, as well as addicted to paracodeine. Next, the US Chief Prosecutor, Robert Jackson. He set the terms for the trial in his opening statement. And he said this line that is still very well remembered, that the record on which we judge these defendants is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow. Next up is this fascinating document. It's only recently been unearthed. And in the scribbles, you can see the possible defenses of the Nazis, including things like, I didn't know, the end justifies the means, or a real standout, option number 3, please, it wasn't me, it was Hitler. But this does underscore that the Nazis were given the rights to lawyers, they had full defense rights, and the cross-examination was conducted in a free and fair way, according to the legal experts that we've spoken to. This next photo, a horrifyingly familiar scene to us of concentration camp prisoners in their striped pajamas, but to contemporaries at the Nuremberg Trials, completely novel and shocking and horrifying on a level that's really hard for us to imagine. When the black and white footage that the Allies had captured was played at the Nuremberg Trials, it was such a key moment of irrefutable evidence, just deeply horrifying about what humanity is capable of. And this is a front page of the New York Times, dated Tuesday, October the 1st, 1946. And it is, hot off the press, the verdict of the Nuremberg trials, all except 3 of Nazi war chiefs guilty. And it notes that the fate of Hermann Göring will be heard today. We know that he went on to be sentenced to death by hanging, but avoided that via suicide. This next photo is of John C. Woods. He was the Nuremberg hangman, and he was an American master sergeant who carried out executions of 10 major Nazis after the International Military Tribunal sentenced them to death. But interestingly, documents have later showed that he had no formal training in execution techniques, which could be a reason for the fact that some of them were botched at Nuremberg. One senior officer is actually said to have called him over-eager when it came to his duties. And our final photo, deeply historic and creepy, is Hermann Göring, showing how he escaped the hangman because he had a cyanide capsule hidden somewhere on his person or in his cell. And how it got there remains one of the great mysteries of Nuremberg. So after a US Army medical team confirmed his death, they performed an autopsy, they took these photographs, and a secret cremation took place. And his ashes weren't kept, they weren't buried, they weren't returned to his family. Instead, they were loaded into a container and driven to a remote river where they were scattered. But there's one photo that's perhaps less iconic, definitely lesser known when it comes to Nuremberg, and that's of the psychiatrist, Dr. Douglas Kelley. He was the psychiatrist who was put in charge of assessing the sanity and fitness for trial of the Nazi leaders. And his story has just been told in film in Nuremberg, which stars Russell Crowe as Hermann Göring and Rami Malek as Douglas Kelley. The movie is based on the book, The Nazi and the Psychiatrist, which tells the story of a relationship unlike any other in history. And the author of that book, Jack L. High, joins us now. Jack L. High, it is fantastic to have you on History Uncensored, The Nazi and the Psychiatrist. Brilliant. And essentially it's the story of the US psychiatrist Douglas McGlashan Kelley, who's assigned to assess the sanity and fitness for trial of the Nazi high command at Nuremberg. This formative relationship he develops with Göring, and then the dangerous conclusion that he comes to that the world isn't ready to hear.
Exactly. Thank you for having me here, Bianca. It's great to be with you. This book, I wrote it back in 2013. It changed the course of my career and of my writing. And so the work of Douglas Kelley and his involvement with Hermann Göring and the other German defendants at Nuremberg is still having an effect. I hope it affects readers.
And that effect is being amplified at the moment because it's been made into a movie. Your book has been translated to film with Russell Crowe playing Göring and Rami Malek as Kelley. Were you happy with how it turned out?
I am happy. I feel relieved that I can honestly recommend it to my friends. And what I like best about it, I don't think anyone should expect any film based on true events to be 100% historically accurate, and Nuremberg isn't, but it is plenty accurate enough, I like to say, and it delivers the messages, the most important messages that were in my book. Those have translated to the movie.
And the eponymous psychiatrist of your book is Douglas Kelley. Tell me about who he was as a man and how he ended up behind the scenes at Nuremberg.
Douglas Kelley was an unusual man, and he had an unusual upbringing. He grew up in a small town at the north edge of Lake Tahoe in Northern California. And it's a historically significant place because it's right alongside this town, right alongside the site of a great tragedy in American history, the ordeal of the Donner Party. And the Donner Party was a group of travelers moving overland to the West Coast in the 19th century. Once they hit the mountains, the Sierra Nevadas, they ran into a horrible set of blizzards, had to spend this awful winter in the mountains, and ended up, to survive, members of the party ended up cannibalizing other members. So Douglas's grandfather, Charles McGlashan, was the first historian of the Donner Party and had a private museum containing all these grisly artifacts of the group. So Douglas grew up among that. His mother, one of the very early practicing attorneys in California, had a dark perspective on the world. She thought that the world was a place you had to be wary of. They were dangerous things. She imparted these beliefs to Douglas, who grew up very bright boy, attended the University of California Medical School, and after the U.S. entered World War II, found himself working as a psychiatrist in military hospitals in Western Europe, treating soldiers suffering from what was then called battle fatigue, combat fatigue, or shell shock. Today we would call it PTSD. These are people, soldiers who had been traumatized psychologically by what they had seen and experienced and could no longer fight. And Douglas Kelley and his colleagues in these hospitals had good luck using various treatments to help these soldiers, sometimes to get them back to the front, or sometimes enabling them to return home. Anyway, that is why Douglas Kelley, at the end of the war, was in Europe. He had enlisted in the U.S. Army, and he was probably the highest-ranking psychiatrist, or one of the highest-ranking, available in the area at the end of the war, when this international military tribunal was forming to judge the fate of the Nazi high command that had surrendered or been captured at the war's end. So Dr. Kelley received an order to go to a town called Mondorf in Luxembourg, where several of these German captives were being held in a hotel, former hotel, and his job, according to the tribunal, was to assess whether they were mentally fit to stand trial. It's a kind of mental fitness that is a very low bar. What it means is, are these men able to understand the charges against them? Can they participate in their own defense? Do they know right from wrong? But not enough for Kelley. He wanted greater challenges, given this incredible opportunity to be among the men widely seen as the worst criminals of the 20th century. So he set out on a mission, a self-appointed mission, to determine really what made these men do what they did, and to find out whether they shared a common psychiatric disorder that could account for their heinous behavior and crimes.
You've dropped a couple of tidbits there that will be important for our viewers to remember. The fascination with the macabre and his family, a darker view of humanity as early influences. So let's hold on to those ideas while we talk about when Kelley arrives at Mondorf and he meets Hermann Göring, the Reich Marshal, for the first time. In those moments, how is Göring seeing himself? As a prisoner or still as a statesman and potentially a negotiator?
Göring is adjusting at this moment. When he surrendered a couple of weeks earlier in Austria, he still thought of himself as an important statesman. Being a captive, a prisoner, wasn't on Göring's agenda. He really had a vision of leading Germany through the post-war period into whatever its new relationship would be with its European neighbors. And this was not a vision that the Allies shared. They viewed him and his colleagues as war criminals and treated them as such. So in Mondorf, Göring was sitting in his cell, as all the others were, trying to figure out what was happening. But he was also addicted to a narcotic called paracodeine. In fact, one of the curious aspects of this story is that at the end of the war, Göring had managed to corner nearly the world's entire supply of paracodeine for his own use. He was taking dozens of these pills a day. So when Kelley met him, one of his first tasks was to wean Göring of his addiction and also to improve his health. Göring had health problems, heart problems, and the last thing the Allies wanted was for such a prominent defendant in this forthcoming trial to die before the trial started.
Now, you've hit on a really important point about the substance abuse and addiction, the tens of thousands of paracodeine tablets that Göring had on him when he was arrested and captured. Now, what were Kelley's actual conclusions once he had time to sit with these Nazi leaders? Because he was expecting madness, and then we'll get on to the drugs and the potential impact.
He was postulating that they shared what he called a Nazi virus that accounted for their behavior. And of course, this wasn't a physical virus. It was a mental illness that led them to commit terrible war crimes together. But as Dr. Kelley examined them, he brought along with him a battery of tests and also got involved in intensive interviews with all of the defendants, especially Göring. He came to believe that there was no Nazi virus, that they did not share any kind of serious psychiatric disorder, and in fact, their personalities all lay within the normal range. That doesn't mean that their behavior was okay because it was normal, or that many other people are like that, but that it was within the span of normalcy that a psychiatrist would expect to find.
There's a passage from your book, actually, where you've written, their time together, speaking about Göring and Kelley, showed Kelley the charm, persuasiveness, and excellent intelligence bordering on the highest level of Göring. The Nazi was funny, charismatic, well-mannered, and cultured. These admirable qualities did not blind the psychiatrist to Göring's inherent wickedness. However, Kelley was intrigued by Göring's ability to carry out policy no matter how brutal. So, as you said, he's surprised to find out that there's evidence of empathy. I was really stunned in your book to read about Göring's progressive legislation that he supported for animal welfare, and obviously the care he showed towards his family, and these things confused Kelley. Back for a moment to the addiction, because basically Kelley's conclusion was that all of the defendants, apart from Ley, were sane. That notwithstanding, the level of addiction and opioid use that we see among that Nazi high command is quite stark, especially when you think, yes, there was use of these drugs after World War I because people were treating injuries and they had PTSD. But to see such prevalence among the leadership, it seems like a really notable and important factor.
It is, although to the best of my knowledge, Kelley did not have to treat any of the other 22 defendants for any kind of drug dependency, and that Göring's was not only notable among that group, but obvious. He really couldn't stop taking those tablets, and to wean Göring off of paracodeine, Kelley decided to appeal to Göring's vanity, and told him that for a normal mortal, getting rid of an addiction like this is very difficult. But everyone knows Hermann Göring was not a normal mortal. He had superior qualities, and he should be able to do it. And Göring accepted this explanation and went off of it, I won't say easily, but without complications. And within a month or two was no longer craving paracodeine. As far as their relationship goes, Göring and Kelley, I think it's important to emphasize the last part of the passage that you read, that Kelley was always very aware of Göring's dark side, that the man lacked conscience, he lacked remorse, he lacked empathy except for members of his own family, and that he was a dangerous man for those reasons. Yet it was obvious to everybody, including Kelley, that he was a charmer, that he had a good sense of humor. He was everybody's favorite prisoner for those reasons. People liked being around him, and those qualities also made him a natural leader among the other prisoners. And he was, after all, the highest ranking German in captivity.
Yeah. What was the arc of their relationship, Kelley and Göring? And do you think that Kelley underestimated how much Göring was studying him?
Both of these men were master manipulators. I believe they were similar in many ways, both highly intelligent, egotistical, convinced of their own rightness most of the time, but especially manipulators. And Kelley began his manipulations and came to see that Göring was doing the same thing to him. I believe this did surprise him. But after a time when they were both aware of this mutual manipulation, they got used to it and were certainly aware of it, and each used manipulation to his own benefit to get what he wanted. So it was a complex relationship. It can't be called a friendship, not at all, but I think it was a mutual admiration happening and a recognition of the familiar one to the other.
There was another psychiatrist on the scene, eventually, Gustav Gilbert, who came to different conclusions than Kelley and didn't seem to share the similarities that you just outlined. So on paper, we think perhaps he was being more objective, and that's why he didn't come to a different conclusion. But actually, the research tends to back up what Kelley thought.
Yes. Dr. Gilbert came from a much different background from Dr. Kelley. Gilbert's background, he was a PhD psychologist, and he came from a more academic background. His personal background was greatly different. He was fluent in German. Kelley was not. Dr. Gilbert was Jewish. Kelley was not. And so these differences set up different kinds of relationships between the two men and the defendants. Kelley's inability to speak German wasn't a serious handicap with many of the defendants who were fluent in English, including Göring. But Gilbert's fluency in German did help him understand those Germans who weren't fluent in English. And the differences in their conclusions were vast. Kelley concluded that these men were essentially normal, which meant that there were other people like them around us, always, every country, every era, and that we need to be constantly on guard that the end of the war, the conclusion of the trials, the creation of the United Nations with its vision of world peace, none of that would stop these kinds of people from doing what they do naturally, which is to opportunistically and without a hint of public service in their mind, attain power to control others. Gilbert, on the other hand, believed that some of these men did share psychiatric illnesses that accounted for their behavior. But I personally like Kelley's interpretation better because I think it has held up better over time. And also it's more satisfying because it holds these men accountable, responsible for their actions. If what can a monster do besides being a monster? But if someone is making choices to commit crimes, then we can hold them responsible and accountable.
Another story which is testament to Kelley's insatiable desire to try and understand these men is the Nazi brain removal caper, which you've written about. Tell me more.
So this brain episode involves one of the defendants named Robert Ley. And Dr. Ley was, he's one of the lesser known of the defendants. He ran a government agency in Germany called the German Labor Front. It supervised slave labor efforts in Germany, among other things. And Dr. Ley was one of the few, the only of the 22 defendants that Kelley believed may be suffering from a disorder that would account for his behavior. Ley had been involved in an airplane crash years earlier, had been unconscious afterwards for a time, and Kelley suspected that Ley had brain damage. In fact, he diagnosed this brain damage in Ley using one of the tests that he brought along with him, the Rorschach inkblot test. Back then, not now, that test was used as a diagnostic tool. Anyway, unfortunately, Ley committed suicide before the trial began. And Kelley was desperate to get a hold of this brain, to have it examined, to see if his hunch was correct about Ley's brain damage. And so he pulled a few strings and surreptitiously had Ley's brain removed and shipped to the United States in a little box labeled spices, and had a pathologist look at it who confirmed that, yes, Ley had brain damage. Whether that accounted for his behavior, who knows? But Kelley saw it as a vindication of his diagnosis. As it happens, another pathologist a few years later looked at Ley's brain samples and said, no, he didn't have brain damage. So it's a little murky what all of this really means.
After Goering is sentenced, we know he evades death by hanging and commits suicide with a cyanide capsule. There's so much mystery around how he procured that capsule. You've done a lot of research into this, and I know in the book you go into some theories. What's most credible to you?
Well, the starting place about Göring and his cyanide capsules is that nobody knows how he got access to the capsules. There's no doubt that Göring, along with many others in the Nazi high command, were issued cyanide capsules, and several of them used them. And it's believed that Göring brought along at least 2 of them with him when he surrendered, and that these capsules were perhaps hidden among his belongings that he came with, his clothing and other items. And the best theory, I think, is that at some point, Göring made an exchange deal with one of the American guards, that the guard would get some of the valuables that Göring had brought along, and in exchange, that guard would bring to Göring the cyanide capsules. When Göring did use one of the capsules on the evening before his scheduled hanging, there was another capsule in his cell, hidden in a canister of cold cream or some kind of skin cream that he had. So he had a fallback in case something happened to the other capsule.
Now, Kelley departs Nuremberg before the trials are over. He returns home. What happens to him after that? And how long of a shadow does Nuremberg cast over the rest of his life?
Kelley was deeply shaken by what he had concluded from his time in Nuremberg, that these men were essentially normal and plentiful in our society. And so professionally, that caused him to rethink what he was doing. He had been a psychiatrist for a good long time now, but he began to believe that psychiatry couldn't account for these men's behavior. So instead, over many years, he turned to another field, criminology, because he thought perhaps that could account for the behavior of the Nazis and other criminals. So that combined with other problems that Dr. Kelley was having in his personal life. He became a heavy drinker. His marriage developed serious problems. He became depressed. He came to believe that the U.S. government was persecuting him during the Red Scare of the McCarthy era. And by the end of the 1950s, he was in very ragged shape psychologically.
And after that, viewers may or may not know that he ends up taking his own life by the same method as Hermann Göring.
Yes.
After researching both men and their relationship and the context of the time where people are killing themselves with cyanide, especially in a military context, what do you make of that?
Cyanide is an unusual method to use in taking one's life because it is very painful and very rapid and not pleasant in any way. And so one of the questions I had going into researching this book was, could I find that there was any connection between Göring's death by suicide and Kelley's death by suicide? I determined there was, but it was not what you might suppose it would be, that that Kelley had learned about Göring's suicide, stored it away in his memory, and thought when the time came, that worked for Hermann, this is how I want to go too. That I believe is not what happened. Instead, what happened, I think, is that cyanide appealed to both of the men because of who they were, the kinds of men they were, and the predicaments they found themselves in. Göring wanted to make a bold statement in his death that the Allies were not going to get their way in how Göring died. He was going to do it his way. It was an act of defiance. And Kelley, in a similar manner, was really at the end of his psychological rope as the year 1958 started, and was desperate. He had gotten into an argument with his wife after burning his hand while cooking. He, in a frenzy, ran upstairs in their home to his home office where he had a lab with chemicals, pulled out a canister of cyanide, not a capsule, brought it downstairs to a landing that overlooked the living room of their home, a very dramatic setting for all this, almost a stage, and declared something to the effect of, I can't stand this anymore. No one understands me. And he popped some of the cyanide granules into his mouth. One of the people I interviewed was an eyewitness to this, Dr. Kelley's son, Doug. He was 10 years old at the time. And he believes that that it was a demonstration on his father's part of distress, and that taking the cyanide was an impulsive act, not a planned act, and that he believed his father was even surprised that he had done it. And Doug, the son, was certainly surprised that he had done it.
One last question to you, Jack. It's kind of a meta question. So we know how much the experience of Nuremberg and coming to the conclusions that he did, that the Nazis were psychologically normal en masse, deeply affected Kelley and disturbed him and led to many difficulties later in life. As you undertook the study of Kelley and became absorbed in those conclusions yourself about the Nazis, about humankind, did it have an effect on you as well?
Yes, it did. I wrote this book back in 2013. At that time, Kelley's warnings, he came back to the States with warnings about how this kind of authoritarian criminal government could recur anywhere, including in the U.S. He observed it in certain politicians of that time in America. And that seemed to me, when I wrote it, 2013, a somewhat distant echo, because at that time in the U.S., these extremist groups, authoritarians, were on the fringes of the American political scene. Now, 12 years later, they are much closer to the center of the American political scene. And it has affected me to, in the sense of wanting to pay more heed to what Dr. Kelley was warning about and to pay attention to what he proposed to save democracy from this authoritarianism.
I thought it was really interesting. I saw a couple of articles about Nuremberg, the movie, where certain voices had criticized lines in it which they said were deliberately echoing today's politics. But when you look at when your book is published and you look at the texts that it's based on, there was no fabrication. The echo is there because it's there.
No fabrication at all.
Yeah.
Kelley wrote or spoke those words. There were things on his mind. And so that, in that sense, it's completely accurate.
Film helped build the Nazis, expose them, and still shapes the way that they're remembered. Goebbels, the chief propagandist, controlled the German film industry, and he used cinema to bypass reason and create the imagined Volksgemeinschaft. Well, he always filmed Hitler as this messianic figure, always shot from below, so always seeming larger than life. And then at Nuremberg, justice and cinema worked side by side. The trial itself became this moral drama for the world to have access to see. And then the black and white footage of the concentration camps that the Allies captured became the most irrefutable and devastating evidence. And since then, Hollywood has reinvented the Nazi as a caricature villain, satirically, or pushed them to the edges in films that try to recenter the victims, like Schindler's List or Life is Beautiful. Some films try to examine the perpetrators themselves, and the new Nuremberg film sits squarely in that space. The final frame of it has this quote, which is from my favourite historian, Archie Collingwood, and it's, "The only clue to what man can do is what man has done." So when an actor steps into the skin of a Nazi, they're shaping how millions are going to imagine cruelty and its warning, because most people don't get their history from books or archives. They get it from film. So that carries a responsibility and a kind of danger and revelation, especially if you're playing someone like Hermann Göring. And my next guest has done exactly that. Well, Brian Cox, thank you so much for joining us on History Uncensored. Welcome.
You're welcome.
One of the reasons that we're chatting today is about the process and your portrayal of Hermann Göring in Nuremberg, the miniseries that came out in 2000, which is considered one of the definitive portrayals, and rightly so. You won an Emmy for it. There have been many attempts to analyze and understand Göring's psychology. He is a complex man. We also know that he had substance abuse issues, although he seemed to be able to wean himself off fairly effectively when he was in Nuremberg, but paracodeine.
Well, actually,
predominantly.
it was his jailers who weaned him off it. It was the worst thing they did, because he became so clear because of the substances that he was been suffering from. And in fact, that was the problem. That was the problem.
Yeah.
If they'd left him alone, they would have ran circles around him. And if he hadn't cleared himself, he would not have been able to take Jackson on the journey through the whole rise of National Socialism.
I think that is one of the fascinating elements of the law of unintended consequences. But they wanted a fair trial, and so therefore that was the priority. But I'm curious, how did you get into the psychology of him? Because obviously Douglas Kelley, Gustav Gilbert, they analysed him in person. Subsequently, people have tried to. We know there was abuse of substances, but there's debate about whether or not he was pathological with very strong aggressive narcissistic traits, or was he more ordinary but ruthless? How did you get into his mindset?
Well, I think he was definitely a bit of a showman as much as anything else, Göring. But also he was not intrinsically nasty. He really wasn't. That would be hard to find. But he was clear about how Germany should be shaped. Very clear and very passionate about that, and believed that Hitler was the man to run the show. Towards the end of the war, he never lost his faith in Hitler. He always believed that Hitler would come right in the end. And of course, that's where he was severely mistaken. And he couldn't see the fact, he couldn't really get it was very hard for him to get a sense of Hitler's own particular madness, because he was mad in his own way as well. So it was always very hard to get a proportion on that. And he followed them. He'd made this plea. He came back after suffering a severe nervous breakdown. He came back from Sweden, and came back to really do the job of, helping Hitler become the Führer, as he did. And there's no question about it. His organizational skills were absolutely brilliant. That was his gift. And he believed that possibly National Socialism was the answer to that was the lecture he gave Jackson. And Jackson, he just ran circles around Jackson. And it was the history about how out of the Treaty of Versailles, they were punished so badly. And that's the root of why Hitler came about. Because if we hadn't punished the Germans so badly, a sort of revenge thing, we might not have had the rise of Hitler. And certainly not, we wouldn't have had Göring coming back from Sweden to work with him. So there's a lot of elements which contribute to the character of Göring.
There's one scene in particular that really struck me. They're all very powerful in your performance. And it's the one where Göring is in the cell with Gustav Gilbert, the US psychiatrist. And Göring is claiming that the atrocities, of course, bother him, and that he's a man of war and practicality. And you play that very convincingly, as if we're supposed to be convinced. And then he discovers that Gilbert is Jewish, and you see the character turn on a dime and have this curiosity, but also amusement that speaks to a lack of empathy. And I thought that was interesting and makes me wonder if you were playing him like he believed his own logic, or like he was calculated and ruthless and lacking in empathy.
I think it's a collection of all those things. I do think he follows his own logic, but I also think he was quite naughty. He could be quite naughty, Göring, about how he kind of moved things around. He was a brilliant politician in that way, absolutely brilliant. His great love was for the UK. He never wanted to invade the UK, for example, because he thought the UK, he felt the UK gave them, it was the UK that gave him the example of concentration camps. That came directly from the UK, from what they did in the Boer War. So it was an interesting development. And in that scene with Gilbert, it's a fascinating scene because he touches on something, and the anti-Semitism, and this is what one doesn't really understand the level of what that anti-Semitism was. And it was also to do with businesses that were allowed to continue, that the Germans couldn't deal with. And they always had that power. So that was that power that they didn't like. And it was much more about economic thing than really about religion, more than anything else, I think. And of course, it's become now about religion and anti-Semitism. But it wasn't initially about that. It was about how he felt the Jews had kind of undermined, whether it's right or wrong, I'm not saying, but he felt the Jews had undermined what was going on in the rise of Hitler. And Hitler, of course, was anti-Semitic. He really hated the Jews. So all of this kind of helps to add to the character. But he did believe in Germany, and he did believe in what Hitler could do in terms of Germany.
We know that most people don't get their history of the Nazis in Nuremberg from archives or tomes with many footnotes. They get it from TV and film.
Yes.
Does that fill you with a certain sense of responsibility when you approach a role like that? Is that on your mind?
Well, you've always got to, I mean, no one is intrinsically bad. There are some people who are probably, kind of, I mean, I think Hitler definitely had a screw loose. There was no question that this was a guy who had suffered a lot of abuse as a young man, who was a painter, street painter, and also had been through the war. He'd been through the First World War, and he felt that this betrayal after the war was appalling. And it truly was what the Treaty of Versailles did to the Germans, and that's why they felt they needed to protest and eventually become very aggressive in relationship to that. And Göring was very, very pro that aggression. He wasn't necessarily, I mean, he was probably anti-Semitic. I think he probably had Jewish friends because he was actually much more bon vivant as a man, really, and that's the clue to him, is that he was fascinated by so much that was going on, and at the same time trying to keep this very strong line of National Socialism going in a way towards helping. So there was kind of two elements to him all the time, and always sometimes contradictory to one another. And he understood that contradiction, and he kind of rode it out.
Film, it feels to me, Brian, is inextricable from Nazism in a couple of ways, because obviously film was used by the Nazis and Goebbels to create the environment that they wanted, to portray Hitler as this messianic figure, create the German community. Then the Nuremberg trial was filmed, and it was the footage of the camps that was a really big turning point in the trial.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
then since then, we've seen Nazis depicted in different sorts of ways, in very almost caricature villains, satirically, and then in a more psychologically probing way, like your portrayal. Would you reflect on that?
Yeah, I think so. The thing that I chose to affect him was the camps, and there was a particular scene of the various what was going on, the filming of the camps, where a young woman's body is brought out of a grave, and her long black hair falls in a certain way. And that was the thing that touched me, because that was a kind of harsh reality. This rather beautiful girl, Jewish clearly, who had suffered at the hands of the Germans. And that I made that affect him in his prison cell. I made him reflect on that was something that perhaps we had gone a step too far. He never admits it. He never says it. But I think from his humanistic point of view, that was something that really touched him. and didn't alter who he was. It just meant that he saw what the extreme of that had been, what the extreme of anti-Semitism had resulted in.
We hear the phrase applied to the Holocaust and Nazism, never again, frequently, and it's unique in historical topics because historians and experts want there to be a moral imperative. It's not just an objective analysis. Like they want people to remember and not to repeat this. And you're obviously somebody that's very politically involved and you speak out on politics. What role do you think actors play in bringing these events to life to ensure that there aren't rhymes of these atrocities in the present day?
Well, I think it's about the truth. You have to create the truth of a situation and follow that truth through.
Well, Brian Cox, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for chatting to us about that.
You're welcome.
So the Nuremberg Trials gave the Nazis a fair trial, proved crimes against humanity, and delivered justice for the world and for history. Case closed. Well, not quite. Because after the infamous 1946 international military trial that we've discussed, there were 12 more trials where doctors, judges, industrialists, and other Nazi collaborators were put in the dock. And then after 1949, no major Nazi trial took place again at Nuremberg. Something had changed. So I spoke to Professor David Cohen from the Center for Human Rights and International Relations to find out why. So far on this episode of History Uncensored, we've been talking about the lead up to and the success of the early Nuremberg trials. You work a lot in this area and on international law in general. Could you tell our viewers why the trials, after being successful and setting these precedents, fizzled out?
That's a good question, and the easiest answer is the Cold War. And the result, because of the voting structure of the Security Council of the United Nations, was a deadlock between the great powers on the Security Council. So that hope for Nuremberg as a model for a future permanent international court faded, and the whole idea of accountability for international crimes was really on hold until 1993 and the wars in Bosnia, when the Security Council, because of shifts in the end of the Cold War and shifts in international relations, was able to once again agree upon the creation of an International Criminal Tribunal, the ICTY.
And speaking of fading, Professor, the state of the archive from the first Nuremberg trials to today, talk to us about what happened to it in the intervening period and how is it preserved now?
Yeah, so the Peace Palace in The Hague, Hague considering itself to be the capital of international justice, became the repository for the archive of the Nuremberg trials. Nuremberg itself was largely destroyed by Allied bombing. It took more than a half century until what was the Nuremberg courtroom became the Nuremberg Museum in the Nuremberg Principals Academy, which it is today. So all of the records of the trials were of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg were moved to The Hague, where they remain in terms of the original copies. As we've moved into an age where there's a recognition that digital preservation and creating access through digital media is not only possible but very important. At Stanford, we began discussions with the Peace Palace regarding the electronic archive. The Holocaust Memorial in Washington, D.C. had done the same. And so the complete electronic record of the court, the multimedia archive, is now available in something at Stanford we call the Virtual Tribunal, which ultimately we hope will encompass all of the international tribunals that dealt with international crimes from Nuremberg until today.
And you're leading this project to digitalize the Nuremberg Archive. How complete were the materials that you've been collecting from the repositories where they've been sitting since the Nuremberg trials in the 40s? Were they damaged? Have they been carefully preserved in terms of the footage, the photos, transcripts?
Yeah, so the documentary record, the transcripts, and all the rest had been well preserved, and paper copies of those had actually been distributed to a series of what were called repository libraries in the United States and the UK. There have always been issues about the film footage from the trial. The trial was not filmed completely. It was filmed for newsreel and so forth. And so there were different collections in different places, one in the UN archive in New York, another in Nuremberg, some others, all of which were slightly shorter or longer. But, for us, what we've taken as a definitive, multimedia collection is what was preserved at the Peace Palace, which was all in good enough condition that it could be digitized. So everything was digitized, the photographs, the film footage, and the complete audio record. So the audio record of the trial has never really been readily available, and it's now available as part of the virtual tribunal.
How critical is the preservation of the archive to refuting Holocaust denial?
To me, it's absolutely central because without the preservation of the historical record in a form in which it's clear that it has been preserved and not been altered, tampered with, or whatever over the years, the factual record assembled by the war crimes investigators who provided the evidentiary base for the war crimes program in Europe in general, and in particular Nuremberg, really provides a body of evidence that is irrefutable, unless for ideological reasons one just rejects it.
In this episode, we've been exploring Nazis through film as well, looking at how the Nazi regime used film in their propaganda, how it was the footage of the concentration camps captured by the Allies that was such a big turning point in the trial, and then how Nazism has been depicted subsequently in cinema, because most people don't get their history, unfortunately, from archives like the one that you're trying to preserve in digital form. What's your view on the value of people getting history from, I guess, non-primary sources and representations like that when we're trying to keep these subjects alive?
I think it's actually extremely important. Of course, it has to be done responsibly. And as you know, there's a large body of documentary films that have been made about both using Nuremberg material or about Nuremberg or about the Holocaust or other aspects of the war. And then, of course, there have been feature films. It's ironic that most people I know think that the earlier film about Nuremberg, the one with Spencer Tracy and Richard Widmark and Marlene Dietrich, etc., was a film about the Nuremberg trial. It was not. It was one of the subsequent proceedings. It was the what's called the trial of the judges. It was the trial of the Nazi judicial apparatus as one of the 12 subsequent proceedings. And so, that highlights the way that it's really important for people to also understand critically, what they're seeing when they see, when they see a film. On the other hand, I certainly welcome the production of films like the new Nuremberg film, which I have to admit I have not seen yet, in part because I've been in Southeast Asia for a month working. But I think that is important, and as good as some documentary films are, and I would point to, for example, Marcel Ophuls' 4-hour epic documentary, A Memory of Justice, which has interviews with many of the key actors at Nuremberg when they were still alive, including prosecutors, including defendants like Admiral Dönitz or Speer and so forth. Those are very important, but how many people are going to sit through a 4-hour documentary?
Well, thank you so much for joining us and for your work. You know, as somebody that's really passionate about history and obviously preserving the memory of the Holocaust for humanity, but also my grandfather was a prisoner in Auschwitz. So on a personal level, I really appreciate the work that you do to ensure that the archive is safe and the memory is preserved.
Well, and those kinds of memories, you just spoke of your grandfather, are incredibly important to preserve as well, because ultimately it's the experience of all the individuals who suffered, their families, who participated in one way or the other, that is at the heart of this rather than abstract legal principles.
History has forbidden questions, ones we physically flinch from because they feel morally dangerous. Behind the scenes of the Nuremberg Trials, as the tribunal reckoned with the Nazis' murder of 6 million Jews, alongside millions of others, Poles, Roma, political prisoners, one disturbing question haunted the mind of the psychiatrist examining the Nazi leaders. It's still terrifying. Were the Nazis psychologically normal? Not innocent, obviously, and not forgivable, but sane enough that the boundary between us and them feels unbearably thin. My grandfather survived Auschwitz. He was prisoner number 1088, arrested for anti-Nazi propaganda. And he endured starvation, beatings from guards, death marches. But he also told us about how a Nazi once pulled him off some train tracks and another snuck him a glass of milk whenever he could, risking punishment. And even now, I'll be honest, I don't want to hear those truths together. And asking, were the Nazis normal? Were they capable of empathy? Feels like a betrayal of his suffering and everyone else who never came home. But it's the opposite. That discomfort is exactly why we have to look closer. Because if we want to understand the history of how the unthinkable becomes possible, we've got to ask the questions that we'd rather avoid. If we tell ourselves that the perpetrators were these insane monsters, we avoid the harder truth, that they were human. And history shows us that humans under pressure, propaganda, or the law of power, whether they're creating the dehumanizing ideology or complying with it, can commit unimaginable acts. And that was precisely the fear of Douglas and Kelley, the American psychiatrist assigned to assess the sanity of the Nazi high command. His conclusion was one that the world did not want to hear, that Nazi atrocities were not the product of madness. He warned that it could happen anywhere, in any culture, at any time. And that's why the creation of the categories of crimes against humanity and genocide remains so important. And that is all for now. Thank you for watching and listening. Until next time, I'm Bianca Nobilo, and when it comes to history, we always keep it uncensored.